It was a chilly autumn night in Times Square. The city's iconic neon lights flickered, and the streets were as alive as ever. Among the sea of tourists and locals, Sarah was making her way back to her hotel after a Broadway show. She had visited New York countless times, but something about that night felt different. As she passed the glowing billboards, a strange sensation washed over her, like someone was watching her. Sarah glanced around, but the crowd seemed normal, busy with their own lives. Suddenly, she spotted a little girl standing alone, no older than 7, in a tattered white dress. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed distant, staring blankly at the street. Concerned, Sarah approached the girl and asked if she was lost. The girl didn't respond, just stood there silently, clutching a ragged doll in her hand. Something about the girl felt off, but Sarah couldn't just leave her there. "Where are your parents?" Sarah asked softly, but the girl only pointed down 42nd Street. Without thinking, Sarah took her hand and began walking in the direction the girl had indicated. The crowd thinned out as they moved away from the main square, and soon, they were in a much quieter area. It was eerie how quickly the bustling noise of Times Square faded away. The girl's grip tightened, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. They had stopped in front of an old, abandoned building, its windows boarded up and graffiti covering the walls. "Is this where your parents are?" Sarah asked, feeling uneasy. The girl finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, "They're waiting inside." Something about the way she said it sent chills through Sarah's body. She hesitated, but the girl tugged at her hand, urging her forward. The moment Sarah stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the building, the air grew cold, and the city's lights seemed to dim. Suddenly, the girl let go of her hand and ran inside. Panicked, Sarah called after her and followed, but when she entered the building, the girl was gone. The inside was dark and abandoned, the smell of decay filling the air. As Sarah turned to leave, she heard it, a soft giggle, echoing from the shadows. She spun around, but there was no one there. Then, she felt it, a hand on her shoulder. She screamed and bolted out of the building, her heart racing. Back in the safety of Times Square, Sarah tried to calm herself down, but the haunting image of the little girl stayed with her. Later, she learned the terrifying truth. Years ago, a little girl had gone missing near 42nd Street, and her body was found in that very building. Some say her spirit still wanders the streets, looking for someone to lead her back home. Moral: not all who wander are lost in the physical sense. Some souls are trapped, searching for a way out long after they've left this world. Be cautious of what you follow, for some paths lead to dark places. Times Square at night is a chaotic mix of flashing lights, honking cabs, and people rushing in every direction. Nick had just finished a late shift and was eager to catch a cab back to his apartment in Queens. It was well past midnight, and the crowd was thinning, but the energy of the square still buzzed around him. As Nick stood at the curb, a yellow cab pulled up seemingly out of nowhere. The driver, a man in his 50s, smiled at him from the rearview mirror and asked, "Need a ride?" Nick climbed in without hesitation, giving his address as he slouched back in the seat. The ride started normally enough, but as they left the bright lights of Times Square, things began to feel strange. The cab's radio played static, and the streets outside seemed unusually quiet. Nick leaned forward to ask if something was wrong, but when he looked at the driver, his heart skipped a beat. The driver's eyes were no longer focused on the road, they were locked on Nick through the mirror, unblinking and cold. There was something unnatural about the way he stared, and the smile from before had twisted into a sinister grin. Nick's unease grew as the cab turned down unfamiliar streets, taking him further and further from the route home. "Hey, I think we're going the wrong way," Nick said nervously, but the driver remained silent. Suddenly, the cab came to a screeching halt in a dark alley. Without a word, the driver turned around, revealing a face that was gaunt and lifeless, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. Terrified, Nick fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The driver leaned closer, his breath cold and foul, whispering, "You're not going anywhere." Panic surged through Nick as he kicked at the door, finally managing to break free. He bolted out of the cab and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of a nearby diner. When he looked back, the cab was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Shaken, Nick shared his story with a coworker the next day, who told him about the legend of the phantom cab. For years, people had reported seeing a mysterious yellow cab in Times Square, driven by a ghostly figure. Those who got in were never seen again, except for the rare few who managed to escape. Moral: not every ride is meant to take you home. Some journeys lead to places from which there is no return. Always trust your instincts, for they may be the only thing that can save you. Times Square is known for its street performers, musicians, dancers, and costume characters filling the square with life. One Halloween night, Stephanie and her friends decided to check out the festivities. The square was packed with people in costumes, celebrating the eerie holiday under the glow of the giant billboards. As they wandered through the crowd, Stephanie noticed a man dressed in an old-fashioned black suit and top hat, standing still on the corner. He looked like a street performer, but something about him was unsettling. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes seemed to follow her every move. Intrigued, Stephanie walked over, thinking it was part of his act. But as she got closer, she realized there was no crowd around him, no one seemed to notice the man at all. He stood there, motionless, staring directly at her. "Nice costume," Stephanie said nervously, but the man didn't respond. Suddenly, he lifted his hand and pointed directly at her. A chill ran down her spine as she felt the atmosphere around her shift, cold, oppressive, as if the very air was pressing down on her. Her friends, noticing her discomfort, pulled her away, but when she looked back, the man was gone. Shaken, Stephanie tried to brush it off as a weird Halloween prank, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Later that night, as she lay in her hotel room, she heard a knock on the door. Thinking it was one of her friends, she opened it, but no one was there. Then, she saw him, the man from Times Square, standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He raised his hand again, pointing directly at her. Terrified, Stephanie slammed the door and called her friends, but when they arrived, the hallway was empty. They didn't believe her, but she knew what she had seen. The next day, Stephanie researched the performer, only to find an old newspaper article about a magician who used to perform in Times Square in the early 1900s. He was known for his eerie, lifelike performances, but one night, he disappeared without a trace. Many believe his spirit still haunts the square, watching the living and choosing certain people to follow. Stephanie never returned to Times Square, afraid that the unseen performer might still be waiting for her. Moral: not all the performers in Times Square are alive. Some linger in the shadows, unseen by most, but very real to those they choose to reveal themselves to. Beware of what you don't understand, for some spirits are drawn to the living in ways we cannot comprehend. The bright lights of Times Square may shine on the surface, but beneath the neon lies a darkness that many overlook. Spirits from the past, phantom figures, and unsettling presences roam the square, drawn to the energy of the living. They watch from the shadows, waiting for those who are unaware. Always be mindful of your surroundings, for not everything in Times Square is what it seems.